Well, 2023 has gotten off to a pretty rough start for the world of adult animation, with Inside Job getting canceled over at Netflix after it got renewed for an additional season because Netflix is out of their minds at this point in time. They're fine with putting up stuff like Farzar and Paradise PD and Big Mouth and Human Resources, shows that have no passion behind them, that are just lowest common denominator humor, just empty vessels of garbage, essentially. It's been a pretty rough start to the year, but I finally finished the first new show I've seen in 2023, which is Koala Man from Michael Cusack and Company over on Hulu and Disney Plus in some areas. And I'll say right off the bat, if you are a fan of animation, if you are a fan of comedy, if you are a fan of Australia, perhaps, go watch this show. It is definitely worth your time, and I was pleasantly surprised by this show overall. I frankly was expecting The Simpsons, but set in Australia, and the twist is Homer Simpson is a superhero with no superpowers called Koala Man, who is trying to help his town and be accepted by the people around him as their protector. That's what I was expecting from this show, but what it actually is like a comic book parody of everything Australian. And you don't have to have a huge knowledge of Australian pop culture or culture to get all the premises and jokes in the show, because the show does a good job of existing within itself, with a few exceptions. There's a few plot lines and plot points that, to me as an American who doesn't know a whole lot about Australian culture and pop culture, it felt kind of weird and out of place. But the show as a whole is really, really weird and a little bit out of place. It's just bizarre at times. Irreverent would be the word to use when it comes to Koala Man. It is just off the walls, kind of bonkers, and I really had a good time watching through this show. And the one aspect that surprised me most about this entire show, because the animation is great, there's a lot of fantastic stuff there. There's little sequences where you can see they really put the effort in to punctuate some of the lines with fluid animation. There's one specific scene with an emu talking to Koala Man. No spoilers in this video for anything for Koala Man, keep that in mind, but an emu is talking to Koala Man, and it punctuates one of the emu's lines with like this really fluid piece of animation where it's like moving around and its mouth is bouncing around. They didn't need to do that, but there's moments like that throughout this show where you can tell that the animators working on the show and the people behind it really do care, and they're willing to put that extra effort in just for the sake of putting that extra effort in, so it raises the quality just that much more. And the soundtrack too is fantastic. The original music and the music choices that they put in are tremendous. But like I said, the thing that surprised me most about this show was the family dynamic. They set up a really interesting family with 4 characters that all have their own motivations and goals, and by the end of the 8 episodes, all 4 of those characters have grown and changed in some manner over this season, which is a massive breath of fresh air. I mean, I was blown away by that aspect of this show, because you wouldn't think Koala Man would do that. You wouldn't think a show like Koala Man would necessarily need that, but it adds so much more to the show because you become more invested in the characters, and because of that you get more immersed in the show, and as goofy and outrageous as it gets, you're still willing to stick with it and laugh along with the show, even if it gets goofy and pretty dang gross at times, which we'll get to that in a second. But this family dynamic they set up is tremendous, and comparing it to some other adult animated shows, specifically shows on Netflix like Farzar, Paradise PD, Big Mouth, Human Resources, comparing it to shows like that seemingly are allergic to developing its characters and having them grow in any way, it's just leagues better. But like I mentioned just a few seconds ago, the show gets a little gross at times, I would say. A little too gross for me in a few areas. Once you watch the show, you'll know exactly what I mean. There's a few piss jokes, there's a few shock humor jokes that don't land and are just a little bit disturbing, frankly. But then again, when it comes to shock humor and humor that incorporates like violence and gore in animation, depending on how good the animation is, I feel like I'm more accepting towards it. And in Koala Man, the animation is tremendous. So I'm a little more forgiving of those moments than some other people that just are completely disgusted by that kind of shock humor and that kind of gross out humor. I'm a little bit more forgiving because if I can see a lot of work went into the animation, like the MIP scene, for instance, in Smiling Friends, where he like blows up and flips inside out. If I can see a lot of effort was put into it, I'm more accepting of that. And you can tell there's a lot of effort put into these moments in Koala Man, but there's still, they could have used a little bit more tweaking and a little bit more work to make them maybe a bit more clever, a bit more funny, at least for me. I know that won't be the case for everyone. Some people are going to hate it. Some people might love it. I'm a little bit more lukewarm towards that style of humor. But what this show does really, really well with its sense of humor is parodying Australian culture and pop culture. It takes everything Australian and blows it up to the extreme. As an outsider looking in at this show, being in America, never having been to Australia or knowing really much about Australian culture other than pop culture stuff, I had a lot of fun with this show. It was fun, it was goofy, it was irreverent. I really enjoyed it, and I feel like people from Australia might enjoy it even more because they'll get all the little references they do. There's a couple little tidbits I got. There's like a Mad Max reference, there's a Emu War reference, stuff like that I got, but I'm sure there are other things that went over my head that some people from Australia will get. But this show nails that parody aspect, and it nails the superhero parody pretty dang well as well. I think this show, like in another timeline, was like a comic book in the late 90s and early 2000s. That's kind of what it feels like. A comic book parody of Australia with Koala Man. That's what it feels like. And it really is fun and unique. I can't really point to many other shows like Koala Man because they're just not there. You can maybe point to some of Justin Roiland's work in the past because he's an executive producer on the show, or some of Michael Cusack's work in the past because he's pretty strange and weird with his sense of humor at times. He can be really Australian with it as well. If you saw the Poloni Halloween special, he did a segment on that, which is basically two guys talking with Australian accents for a few minutes, and it's pretty weird and out there. Like, that's probably the closest you can get, but it really is a unique thing in the world of adult animation, and I'm very, very happy to have watched it, and I'm very, very happy that it got made. Here's hoping for a season 2 of Koala Man. I really do think this show can do some great stuff with some tweaking, specifically with that shock humor and gross out humor, and I wish it would take its overarching plot, because it does have an overarching plot with like a main big villain for Koala Man. I wish it would take that and blow it up a little bit more. It felt a little too small, I guess, for this first season, and the way they resolve this big overarching story just isn't that satisfying, and it's punctuated by another gross out joke that's just not super funny to me. It didn't hit for me at all. It's a pee related joke. I'll let you get to it in the show when you watch it, but it just didn't hit for me all that great, and it was a little underwhelming towards the end. But there's so much stuff in between all of that, in between that big overarching story. There's stuff with the family getting developed that I still think the show is definitely worth watching, and it has so much potential for the future, because it's not easy. I know I point to these shows on Netflix that are allergic to developing their characters, as I said, but developing your characters in a meaningful, interesting way so that they change over an entire season, that's not an easy thing to do. Sometimes you can change them in a way that the audience doesn't like Paradise PD tends to do. It tends to take all of its characters that are annoying, and by the end of the season, they're even more annoying. I guess you could count that as change. I call it wearing down my brain. But for Koala Man to pull off this with 4 separate characters in a family with that dynamic, for them to do that in just the first season is really impressive. And I think they've earned a second season just with that ability on their own. And add on top of that, the stellar animation, the great music, the tremendous voice acting across the board. After you watch this show, if you're an American like me, at least for me, I'll say personally, I caught myself almost having like an Australian lilt to my accent, I would say. It kind of gets like burned in your brain. That just might be me being too impressionable. I don't know, but there's a lot of great voice acting. There's a lot of great performances. There's a lot of great animation. The theme song is great, and the stories being told are very weird, very irreverent, and as far as I can tell, very, very Australian. And that's where I'll leave it for right now. I don't think I want to say much more other than go check this show out. It's definitely worth your time. Like I said, on Hulu and Disney Plus in some areas. You can just check which one based on where you are residing at the moment. I believe in America, it's on both. Maybe I watched it on Hulu, but I think it's on both as well, so you can check it out there. If I had to give it a score, score out of 10. It gets held back in some areas. It's definitely a bit iffy at some parts with its humor, and I wish its overarching story would be better. I think it's probably like a 7.5 for me. 7.5, maybe lilting up towards 8 at a few moments in a few episodes. But it's definitely worth your time. It's no masterpiece for sure, but I think given enough time and given the chance to do a second season, this show could be something really, really special. And like I said, there isn't much to compare this to in the world of adult animation right now. It's like a comic book parody of Australia. And if that premise interests you even in the slightest, check this show out. That's where I'll leave it. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I'm so glad the first show I watched in 2023 that was new, I enjoyed. That was really nice. I think last year the first new show I watched was Crossing Swords Season 2, which was not good, to say the least. I do not like that show. I think it's canceled now. Let's hope. No good. We'll try again, Robot Chicken Studio. But yeah, to start off the year like this with a show that I really enjoyed, that I'm really optimistic about for the future, it's great. And I hope they get a chance for a season 2. But thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe and all that stuff. And I will see you guys in a few days to talk about Velma on HBO Max, which I've been trying to stay away from spoilers and stuff and trailers and everything. I'm trying to go in as blind as possible, but I've heard a few rumblings about Velma that make me kind of concerned, but I'm going to try to go in as blind as possible to give the show a fair chance. So stay tuned for that. I will see you all next time. Goodbye.